Welcome back to News in Focus. Now, the Board of Healthcare Funders says Parliament shirked its constitutional obligations when it passed the NHI Bill in 2023 so that the ANC could be using it as an electioneering platform. In a new legal challenge against the legislation, which has yet to come into effect, the medical scheme body is now challenging Parliament's public participation process. The BHF said Parliament adopted the bill blindly without crucial information such as the services that will be offered under the Act nor the cost involved. Joining me now is the Managing Director for the BHF, Dr. Katlego Mothudi. Dr. Mothudi, thank you so much for joining us on News in Focus on Hilaal TV.
Good evening and thanks for having us.
Absolute pleasure. Doc, let's start off, of course, of how we got here in terms of the BHF challenging government in terms of this bill.
The decision to start a litigation process did not come immediately, nor was it an easy decision. We have been active participants in the consideration of healthcare reform since the beginning when the government introduced the Green Paper. We have submitted our thoughts and proposals throughout the process, through the white paper and through the various draft bills. It was really out of frustration when we saw Parliament, in this case, going ahead without any meaningful change to the proposed bill and now act, despite the thousands of submissions. And we feel that these attempts were correctly placed to improve what was put on the table. And they came from a position of goodwill. And it wasn't just us, it's many other entities that have been participating. So it was really out of frustration and in recognition of the need to adhere to the constitutional processes when we introduce laws into how we govern things.
Talk to us about this decision to take this matter to the Constitutional Court.
I think healthcare is a very personal and emotive issue. It affects everyone. And we could very well argue that everything is anchored on a good healthcare system. And if you talk to the WHO and the World Bank, they will tell you that if you've got a very well-functioning healthcare system, even the country's economy prospers. If there are any doubts, one could refer back to the time of COVID to see how we had to scramble to make sure that we have the right systems in place to make sure that we don't go down the wrong path. So we are aware that our healthcare system is in dire straits, whether you're looking at the state-funded or the private one. On the private side, we have issues of escalating costs. And this was highlighted a few years ago, I think about 6 years ago now, when the Health Market Inquiries report was released. And it showed that the private healthcare sector was facing escalating costs and there was a need for intervention. On the state side, there are also numerous challenges, whether you're looking at perceived poor quality of the services, lack of required medicines and technology, deteriorating infrastructure, as well as inadequate resources in terms of healthcare workers. So we had no choice but to consider reforming our healthcare. And over and above that, we are also part of the global movement to usher in universal health coverage. And this is on the back of the recognition of many issues, whether you're looking at what plagues South Africa and Africa at large in terms of still having communicable diseases as a challenge, and now with the advent of an increase in non-communicable diseases. So we are not at a place where we could choose whether we could sit back or not innovate. And that's why we needed to do something. So these processes were watched by everyone because, as I said, healthcare is everybody's business.
Dr. Mothudi, sections 59 and 72 are two of the contested sections that the BHF feels that the Parliament could potentially have failed in fulfilling the constitutional duties. Why is that the case from a BHF perspective, Doc?
I think there are a number of considerations here. We are very fortunate that under our constitutional democracy, we have a process of consultation. But we have to be careful that when we consult, this has to be meaningful interactions, and also the inputs that are requested or received must be substantive. And we believe that Parliament erred in both regards. The first part of a meaningful consultation is that when you present a proposed bill for people to consider, you must be able to provide as much information as possible so that the inputs are relevant. We have a bill that was very lacking in terms of detail. It did not contain what services are going to be offered, how they will be offered, and the other big part is how they will be funded. As a result, it has actually disabled the very people who were supposed to consider the input. The second part is that those input actually need to be substantive. Often we saw parliamentarians or those who ran the sessions just asking people whether they supported the bill or not without going into details or reasons why they supported, or if they have any challenges, what challenges those are. And that is the crux of the matter. We believe that the sponsors of the bill presented what we label a blank check, which Parliament just signed, with the proviso that the detail will be sorted out. What that does, Parliament abdicates its responsibility of crafting law and delegating it to the ministry as well as other officials who are yet to be appointed to when they deferred the detail of the act. And that's the challenge that we saw in terms of the unconstitutionality of the process.
Dr. Mothudi, Parliament would say, well, we've had this public participation when it has come to the NHI Bill. If I stand to be corrected, it ran for quite a number of years. But when you speak to a lot of people on the ground, they will say their biggest concern is, of course, the lack of the operational aspects of many of the public hospitals. Obviously, the NHI Bill goes beyond that. But from a BHF point of view, what do you feel was probably lacking in terms of public participation?
I think the first part is that we position this bill as if it's the panacea for all ills. When you listen to what the WHO proposes in terms of strengthening of healthcare system, they talk of at least 6 pillars. One of those pillars is the financial aspects, which are partly addressed by the NHI Bill. And I think the concerns from other commentators are that we haven't started looking at the other drivers, which includes leadership and governance of the healthcare system. Whether you're looking at the health workforce, we have been plagued by stories of while we lack adequate resources, you've got practitioners who are sitting at home who are not working. So that's part of the detail that was lacking. But even within the NHI Bill now Act itself, there were other details that were lacking. When you strategize for change, you have to look at the various elements that you are going to implement. You then have to tabulate them, list them, and then you have to cost them, and then figure out where the money is going to come from. Now, none of those questions were actually answered. And when we postulate that we do not have unlimited resources to actually usher in how the NHI is crafted, it looks like we have a defeatist attitude. But we don't have to look far back other than when government tried to introduce the recent budget and there were proposals to increase VAT. It was quite obvious that the population is stretched, the purse is already strained. And these ideas seem quite lofty, because according to many estimations, you probably have to put up maybe 2 or 3 times the national budget for healthcare to be able to achieve anything close to what is being proposed.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Dr. Mothudi. I think South Africans would love universal healthcare, but will this act see the light of day given the many challenges that is being faced, not just with this bill, but South Africa's healthcare as a whole? My conversation continues after the break. Welcome back to News in Focus. I'm still in conversation with Dr. Katlego Mothudi, who is the Managing Director for BHF. Dr. Mothudi, again, thank you so much for staying with us. Doc, the content of this bill, explain to the viewers why the BHF feels that it's not just only unclear, but also premature at the same time.
Maybe to start with the correction, the issue of the introduction of universal health coverage is not really premature. I think what you're questioning is how it's contemplated, or the structure. And then the reason I'm saying that is the introduction of universal health coverage has been mooted from a long time ago. Globally, we're talking about the famous Alma Ata Congress in 1978, which already at that time said countries must look at how they introduce primary healthcare so they can usher this in. There are other documents, whether you're looking at the Freedom Charter, for example, in South Africa around 1955, was already talking about healthcare for all. The second part that I like to say is that universal health coverage is not a once-off event. We talk about progressive realization of universal health coverage. And even this is clearly articulated in our constitution. Section 27 talks about making sure that the population has got essential access to essential healthcare services that are of good quality. But there is a rider that says to the extent that government can provide resources for. So we do need to introduce universal health coverage. What is necessary is how do we take advantage of the resources that we have? And one major resource that we have that is being ignored by this act is actually the private sector, specifically the private funding sector. Section 33 of the act intimates that once the fund is fully established, medical aid schemes and other funders will not be permitted to provide similar services. Now, if you examine what impact that would have, currently medical aid schemes provide services for about 9.1 million South Africans. Now, this is voluntary healthcare services that are purchased by people who've already paid their taxes. It brings in a few issues. One of them is constitutional, in that the bill or the act dictates how people should actually use their disposable income. The second issue is that there is an overstretched public sector. Now, you are going to take the people who were already purchasing their own healthcare system and then forcing them to then get services from this already overstretched service. We know that we do not have unlimited resources. Infrastructure is strained. We don't have enough health workforce that is providing services in the state. So what that would done, it will actually force a deterioration or limitation of access to healthcare services. And we believe that when we consider expanding healthcare services, we must take advantage of all the existing services, and including those that are in the private sector. The state needs to recognize these services as an asset to the state.
I wanted to get your take on the private sector, Dr. Mothudi, because when you listen to, of course, especially from Discovery Health, I mean, they've got the constitutional right to go ahead and challenge this, like many others. They have been up in arms with regards to consultation with regards to this bill. And of course, we find this big divide between, of course, government and the private sector. I want you to get BHF's take on this, because again, you've mentioned it, there are many South Africans who rely on private healthcare, whatever the costs may be. And this, of course, is going to cause quite a void when you read the current contents of this bill.
Yeah, just latching on to my last comment about the recognition of the private sector as a resource. And I also want to remind you of what I started with, that there are challenges on both sides. Now, in 2019, there was a report that was released by the Competition Commission that was carried out as a health market inquiry. They did already make proposals that would have been far-reaching in terms of reorganizing the private sector. This was in recognition of the escalation of costs and the increase in the barrier to entry of access to healthcare services in the private sector. Now, this was recognized and welcomed by the private sector in that we know that the system is not perfect, and that should actually be implemented to make sure that we increase access. That's the first thing. The second area is that the private sector is also, especially the medical aid schemes, have been at pains to usher in what we call low-cost benefit options, which we think, in our opinion, would have increased access to services, healthcare services in the private sector to another 10 million South Africans. Now, this is not a figure that we plucked out of the air. We do know, Stats SA already tells us that over and above the 15% of South Africans that buy their own healthcare from medical aid scheme, there's a further 30% who, out of their own pockets, purchase healthcare from the private sector, even though they do not have medical aid schemes. So there is a recognition that there aren't enough services or adequate access in the state where the private sector has been recognized as an enabler to increasing healthcare services. So we're looking for a position where there is a synergy. This is not unusual. When you look at many countries all over the world, there are actually very few countries that use the state as a single purchaser of services. I think Canada is one such example. But we do know that lots of Canadians actually go across the border and buy their own healthcare from other states. So we see all over the world where there is a deliberate measure to provide access from both sectors. So it is not an anti-state stance that entities like ourselves take when we make proposals that private sector should continue funding healthcare services. It's in recognition that the state does not have enough resources to provide for everyone.
Dr. Mothudi, there is two questions and I want to try and fit them in this 5 minutes that we have. Does the Minister of Health have excess power in the delegation of the bill? If so, how?
So there are a number of issues that we raised in our first submission. If you look at the duties or the responsibilities that are articulated for the minister, we think that they are excessive. And not just that, that they would weaken the governance of the fund. The minister appoints all the committees, the CEO and the board. There's very little parliamentary or cabinet oversight. And we believe that that could actually give rise to even corrupt activities if you have one individual who has unchecked powers. That's the first part. The second aspect is what I referred to in terms of the parliamentary process having not articulated correctly what the act should be like from the onset, but they have delegated a lot of what they should happen to the minister. So in that way, there is an inordinate amount of power that is given to the minister. And if you have a minister of health that observes good governance, that could happen. But imagine if you have one that pays very little attention to good ethical practice, then you run into trouble.
In 2 minutes, Dr. Mothudi, regardless of the outcome of the Concourt decision, how close or how far are we in South Africa of really achieving this universal healthcare?
There's an argument that we already have universal health coverage. When the WHO measures, they call it the service coverage index, we are already measured at about, I think, 64%. And they measure a number of areas, but largely you're looking at access to healthcare services. The other big component is the financial outlay. The issue that prohibits us from being confident about saying we've got universal health coverage is that the exposure to catastrophic financial distress is still large. But that is prevalent in most of the country. So we do have some form of universal health coverage, but we need to extend it. And as I said, universal health coverage is not a once-off event. We talk about a progressive realization of universal health coverage. And that's what we must focus on doing, making sure that all those pillars, medicines and technologies taken care of, infrastructure, refurbishment and development, making sure that we've got adequate numbers of healthcare providers, etc., in the system. Then we will expand universal health coverage.
Dr. Mothudi, absolute pleasure having you. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you very much.
That's Dr. Katlego Mothudi, who is the Managing Director for the Board of Healthcare Funders. I've asked my director, Yemi, just to give me 2 minutes to pay tribute to a colleague at a time, of course, where we see our fellow media practitioners passing away in Gaza. We should not take our eye away from home. My good colleague, Tsidi Madia, passed away yesterday. And when we speak of political journalism, she is right up there, a towering figure, somebody who pulled no punches, someone who took the questions to the politicians and made no mincemeat about it. She was really somebody who took it to them. Before I could even interview politicians, I would listen to her politricking podcasts just to get an idea of the mannerisms, to a certain extent the questions, but also the way I could learn from her. And I learned so much from her listening to her. As a person, she was a wonderful human being. We would have discussions, whether it was at press conferences, State of the Nations, at the elections, where we ran into each other a lot of times. A loss to South African journalism, but a loss to South Africa when you saw how she defended South Africa at a time when these lies were being peddled that there was a white genocide that was occurring in the country. She went on Newsnight and said, that is not happening. She, and this has been mentioned across the entire breadth for the last 24 hours, she was a true patriot. Tsidi Madia, you will be remembered not only as a fantastic person, but as a giant within South African media. We thank you for your contributions to our media space. We thank you for what you've given us. We thank you for the lessons that you've taught, especially myself, somebody who just got into current affairs and politics a few years ago. You truly have inspired an entire nation, and we thank you, Tsidi. We thank you for everything that you've given South Africa. You will never be forgotten. That's all we have for you here on News in Focus. From myself, Faraz Patel, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.